Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. After that fabulous and inspiring Olympic session, we come to a different kind of arena of competition, the battle for global supremacy. If the 19th century was the era of British imperialism, the 20th century, one of American hegemony, the 21st century that we live in was initially talked of by experts as the Asian century. It was projected that the three major Asian countries, China, Japan, and India, would become dominant powers. Yet, less than a quarter of a way of this century, both India and Japan seem to have dropped out of the race. And now there is talk of a solely Chinese century. Instead of the multipolar world that India had hoped would emerge, experts say that we are heading once again to a bipolar one, with a diminishing America holding up one pole and a rapidly rising and aggressive China grabbing the other pole. Let me give you some figures that would give you an idea of China's growth and its importance in recent times. China's GDP is now 3 times the size of Japan and 5 times the size of India, and is fast catching up with America's GDP. China's share of the global output has increased so rapidly that it is expected to overtake the US, the world's biggest economy, sooner than expected. Some predict by 2028 itself, that's 7 years from now. It has already overtaken the US as the world's largest recipient of foreign direct investment just last year. For the first time in the Fortune 500 list of the world's largest companies, more firms were based in China than in the US. It has edged ahead of US in trade with the European Union. And China's overseas lending to developing countries now rivals that of the World Bank. Under its Supremo, Xi Jinping, China is developing its economic, diplomatic, and political influence on a global scale that is alarming most of the world. That is why this session is titled, "The Dragon's Teeth, Is the World Ready for a Chinese Century?" For India, which has already felt the dragon's breath in Ladakh last year, understanding China's game plan and countering it is vital for its strategic autonomy and security. To enable us to get a sense of the significance of the rise of an aggressive China and how the world and India should deal with it, we are privileged to have 2 of the finest minds on the subject. Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, a former National Security Advisor and Foreign Secretary, and Dr. Andrew Small, a senior Transatlantic Fellow at GMF, a highly regarded strategist on China, and author of the book, The China-Pakistan Axis. Let's give them a warm round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start this session by posing the central question to our 2 experts. Do you think that this is going to be the Chinese century? And if not, what kind of century would it be? Mr. Menon, would you take the first shot at this?
It's possible, but unlikely, in my opinion, for 3 reasons at least. One, you'll notice everything that you mentioned about representing Chinese dominance was all economic. I think there's no question China is an economic superpower today. Every market, every commodity price, everything. China's part of all the global value chains. But in other metrics of power, which are equally important, military, for instance, today still the US is the only power that can project military power anywhere around the globe when it wants to. China's still a regional power. Secondly, China's in a very crowded neighborhood with other rising powers. Unlike the US or previous hegemons like Britain, She's not sitting behind two of the largest oceans on Earth. She doesn't have the option of being an offshore balancer, retreating when she wants to. And she, therefore, she's she's tied down in her own neighborhood. The first island chain contains her at sea, and on land she rubs up against countries like India, like Russia, like Iran. These are large countries, and she has to accommodate them if she wants to make it, and she has to then work with others. But most important, China is dependent on the world. Interdependence means dependence as well. She depends on the world for technology. She depends on the world for even finance, though she's very rich as a country, I mean, in terms of reserves. She depends on the world for energy, for commodities to keep her economy going, for markets to sell the products of her factories and so on. So I'm not quite so sure that it's going to be a Chinese century. China will be powerful. She will be one of the dominant powers, and she and the US look like they're on track to be far ahead of everybody else at present rates. But I still don't see it yet as a Chinese century.
Now, come to the other part. So what kind of century do you think it would be?
Well, there's multiple possibilities. All of them with a very powerful China, I mean, that's true. But you know, ideally you would have some form of multipolar world, but you don't have that today, and at least in my opinion. My opinion, you're in a world between orders, and that's why you see all this jostling, pushing, shoving. You saw it on our border, you see it in South China Sea, you see it around Taiwan, you see it East China Sea, Senkakus. That would be some kind of multipolar system which works. The other more likely, in my mind, is that we go on with this confused situation today, where between the big two, they agree on some things. They agree on keeping other people down, making sure there's no more peer competitors for them. But that they'll contend in all these other domains, like cyber, like outer space, like the maritime space around China, but that economically they have to come to some understanding among themselves, because basically they depend on each other. Neither of them can survive. They're really joined at the hips. They're like Siamese twins in a sense. Their economies are so tied into each other. So that's an ideal situation if they do come to some understanding. Otherwise, we're going to see real trouble. And that is the most worrying part. In any one of these scenarios, uncertainty is very high. The risks of accidents are very high. And frankly, while great power conflict seems unlikely, not between China and the US and so on, it doesn't make sense for either of them to get into conflict. But other kinds of conflict, all kinds of other violence, short of a conventional war between great powers, frankly, you already see it all around you. Whether it's civil wars, proxy wars, you've seen what's happening in Afghanistan. So,
yeah.
So for me, most likely a muddled sort of situation going forward in the foreseeable future. We don't know what happens after 5 years, 10 years.
Sure. No, I'd like to come to you, Dr. Andrew Small. You've studied China closely. They are building their military exercise. They are pumping in a lot of money. Mr. Menon's argument is that it's largely financial dominance, economic dominance that's there, and therefore they will not be the kind of superpower that they'd hope to be. What is your estimate of this?
China's always understood power in comprehensive terms. It's one of the few countries where they publish these regular indices on comprehensive national power. The understanding has always been that you have to develop these things simultaneously. Economic power is a precondition for the totality of national power. And we have seen this shift on China's part from, yes, its top priorities are regional, but it has global influence, global equities, and ultimately it does want to be a global military power. I think that's become quite clear. And there is still a view on the Chinese side at the same time that you have to learn lessons from other great powers of the past. The form of Chinese global military power is not something that I think they believe is going to look like the United States. Take Afghanistan as one of the obvious examples. The view on China's part is not that they should have a militarily dominant role or presence in certain parts of continental Asia. The view is that's a trap on the areas of power that matter more. And so I think you're going to see a different version of the form of power that China is, that takes in the lessons from powers in the past, but that treats all dimensions simultaneously. And I think this is almost what you've seen from the US in the last period of time as well, a shift in understanding that also starts to think in comprehensive terms about what the competition with China actually amounts to. China was actually quite comfortable when most of the balancing efforts on the US part were purely military in scope. The shift to treat technology, economics, and all of the other dimensions of power as all part of the same competition in the last period of time has actually been what's given China much greater headaches. Because as Ambassador Menon says, there are still critical forms of dependence that China has. There are still critical forms of dependence that China has, not least on US technology, as we saw when the US went after Huawei. What you're seeing now on China's part, though, is an attempt to transcend those forms of dependency. They want to escape the fate of being interdependent or being dependent on others. What they're trying to do now domestically, what Xi Jinping's big push is essentially to make the rest of the world dependent on China, while China itself is self-reliant. To create a level of interdependence that's asymmetric in China's favor. And that's a difficult task. There are trillions of dollars being poured into this on areas such as semiconductors and other areas. They haven't got there yet. They know these constraints still exist. But we're already on track, and we're seeing how does China transcend some of the last of these limitations of dependence. And that's conditioning a lot of near-term and long-term approach that China's taking to.
You know, Mr. Menon, you had talked of the possibility of a conflict, maybe not a major conflict. Now, 3 weeks ago, the US signed a military pact with UK and Australia called AUKUS. Right? Do you see that as America's best shot at containing China? What is the significance of the AUKUS development?
Well, I see it as...
And this is military.
Yeah. I see it as an attempt to restore balance and therefore stability in the seas around China, through the Indo-Pacific, but particularly in the seas near China, South China Sea, East China Sea. And to that extent, if it restores the balance and prevents domination of these seas by any one particular party, any one country, one military, then, you know, it's a good thing from an Indian point of view. Because for us, it's important that these seas stay open, that you can freely navigate them, use them for peaceful purposes, trade, etc. And I don't see how AUKUS goes against any of that. In fact, it helps to produce that kind of outcome, which we need. But it's only one small part of the larger security architecture that we're talking about, because there is, I mean, China's problem is that she's contained by that first island chain, you know, from Japan all the way through the Ryukyus, Taiwan, etc., all of which, Korea, I mean, basically, these are all US allies. And at sea, she has the world's greatest armada 12 nautical miles off her coast in her face. And this is China's problem. She's trying to project naval power, military power at sea, and she's trying to learn to be a maritime power. And that's a transition that she still hasn't made. And it takes time to start thinking, because you can't think of the South China Sea the way you think territorially of Xinjiang. I mean, it's a different problem at sea. And so I think we're watching multiple transitions. China knows what she needs to do. But every time she does something, there is a pushback, there is a reaction. And AUKUS is a reaction to a Chinese build-up over the last 30 years, and this attempt to become a maritime power which goes beyond just the brown waters around her into the blue oceans.
Dr. Small, I want you to take up that question, but with an additional question that I have, which is we have seen the kind of aggression that China has shown in terms of what they call the gray zone war that it does with Taiwan regularly. They've been strafing their skies, pushing deep into their space, threatening them. We've seen what happened in Galwan Valley in India. do you think this is also a potential conflict zone? Because you never know, as Mr. Menon was saying, that there could be a mistake. We read yesterday in the papers that a US nuclear sub, a foreign object had stuck on it. We don't know what it is, they haven't defined it. And US is also, as part of AUKUS, now going to supply nuclear-powered subs to Australia. So what is your sense? Is there, firstly, AUKUS a serious threat? Second, do you think there would be a smaller conflict, or who knows, a conflagration of a kind that we wouldn't want at this period?
So, I mean, AUKUS has two dimensions. One is the submarine deal, and the other that had less attention is a series of forms of cooperation on areas such as military artificial intelligence, defense industrial policy, other areas. And I think this is one of the things that's going on simultaneously. You're starting to get right now a series of states that are working together more actively in coalition with each other, that feel greater urgency about the need to do so, and that see this as well as a disadvantage for China. In the end, China by itself as a power, yes, is a peer competitor to the United States. The big edge that the US and its allies have is still that alliance network, that wider framework of partners and allies, which I think in the US mind will still, in principle, give it the preponderance of power if you're able to marshal those coalitions effectively. But I think the problem has been, until recently, there have been limitations on countries' willingness to move on certain fronts. The US, of course, hadn't moved as assertively against China as it has until recently. But Australia was very cautious, for instance. We saw that with the Quad, of course, classically as well. But the forms of coercion that Australia has experienced, which have not just been about the naval build-up that they've been seeing on the Chinese part, it's also the forms of economic coercion that they've experienced in the last period of time. And it's made countries willing to take certain steps that I think even a few years ago they wouldn't have been willing to contemplate. I'm not sure that necessarily leads into dangerous conflagration risks. There are instances where that is absolutely the case, where Taiwan will tend to come very, very high up on that list. And that's not necessarily just risks of miscalculation, that's risks of very deliberate calculations on the Chinese side that say that they are, in certain circumstances, willing to take certain actions. We're seeing this certainly in the forms of intimidation that are taking place right now, the kind of psychological warfare that's being waged on Taiwan. But if not in the next couple of years, if not in the next 5 years, there is a real question as to whether China sees a set of conditions where it's simply willing to act. At least in that instance. And I'm in some ways more worried about that than I am about some of the accidents.
And Mr. Menon, you could answer this. Why doesn't China just take Taiwan? I mean, this is like an ABC question, but look, they have built their military power. They have shown that they can use, in our borders. Why don't they just walk in?
Well, three problems. One is, as we saw on our borders, they may not fully achieve what they want. Two, it involves killing fellow Chinese. And the Civil War was over a long time ago. I mean, it's been 70-plus years, 72 years since the Civil War. And for any Chinese leader to be seen killing fellow Chinese without provocation doesn't really make sense, just because he wants to be in the list of greats as the one who reunified China. I mean, that isn't sufficient. And I don't think they know that they can actually win. They're not sure how the rest of the world will respond. There is ambiguity there, deliberate, on the US side. Japan actually has been speaking much more publicly about how they don't want to see a change in the situation. So, they have reason to be careful. But I think the point Andrew's making is that at some stage, the gains of reunifying China, completing this work. Mao Zedong managed to make China stand up, found the PRC, Deng Xiaoping made us rich, and that our present leader managed to reunify the whole country, finish the unfinished work that Mao and Deng couldn't do. I mean, maybe that attraction will override rational calculations. And that's the real fear, which is why I think Taiwan is an exception to most of the other calculuses. And I think we have to keep watching it very carefully.
Now, Dr. Small, India had, along with the US, Japan, and Australia, formed the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And for a while, it just meandered along, and only in the last 2-3 years, it's gathered the momentum And in the first in-person meeting happened just 2 weeks ago, the first in-person summit that's there. Now, has AUKUS taken the thunder away from Quad? Is Quad just another talking shop now? And, there's very woolly notions that experts call of the greater world good, and left all the security issues aside.
I wouldn't oversell AUKUS, really, in the scheme of these things. You have a submarine deal, which one can assess, and then you have a kind of sub-Five Eyes arrangement. The Five Eyes have been attempting in the last period of time, and again, particularly conditioned by what went on with 5G, to kind of expand the scope of the kinds of issues they look like, beyond the sort of intelligence sharing and other traditional means, to look at some of these questions around industrial policy cooperation, some of these other things, forms of technology sharing that can only take place between a small number of trusted countries. But we're now even in a sub-Five Eyes space on this, because New Zealand was more uncomfortable about some of this. There were some constraints on the Canadian side. So this is a smaller subset of a framework that's been in place for a long time, even if it's doing some new things. The UK role, I don't want to denigrate, but in the scheme of US strategy in Asia, if I'm looking at the countries that really matter most, I'm going to put India and Japan markedly ahead of the UK role. The Quad is still going to be...
You're not British.
The Quad is still going to be quite one of the central structures on the US side. There is a level of investment of energy and commitment there. What you saw in the last summit meeting was, of course, this proliferation of different working groups and new areas, and this can sometimes lead to some dismissiveness about it being a talking shop. I think lots of these other areas, what the new architecture is on these questions is going to be critical. This is where a lot of the emphasis on US-China policy, US-Asia policy is going to go. It's not just going to go on the classic military balancing piece, however important that continues to be. It is how are you able to stitch the other partners and allies together comprehensively in all of these other domains as well. And there's a kind of, and you're seeing all of this now done at leader level as well, which is important. You saw this not just with the Quad, but in the exchanges that were taking place in Europe when Biden had his visit, the G7, NATO, other frameworks where China and some of these questions were not dealt with as a top-tier issue in the same way. And now they're being dealt with openly, essentially, between leaders of the world's democracies, and that translates into some quite different outcomes, even if we're still with the kind of the new areas of focus of the Quad and some of what we're seeing transatlantically still in the early days on all of that.
Well, we've got about 7 minutes, and I'd like now to come to India and China. There's a clear and present danger that India faces against China. Mr. Menon, you've seen the border dispute and the kind of aggression that China has shown, and our other issues in terms of trade with China. How do you assess India's, the way India's dealt with China so far, this current regime?
Well, I think this regime, previous regimes, basically we've managed the relationship. The trouble is, of course, that the power balance has shifted against us. When we established a sort of live and let live attitude in Rajiv Gandhi's time, our economy is roughly the same size, we were the same technological level, and India was probably more integrated in the world. Now China's 5 times bigger, the economy, technologically much further ahead than India, and much more integrated into the world. So the balance has shifted, so China's behavior has shifted, because China responds to the relative balance. So we need to change our behavior, and we are in the process of resetting what we're doing. You heard what EAM said yesterday. You'll probably hear from the Foreign Secretary after this. So it seems to me that I don't think we've ever been fooled in the recent past by what we see. Militarily, I think we know how to deal with China, and I don't think China achieved what she wanted tactically on the line in spring 2020. But it's still an ongoing process. We'll have to see where this goes. The line is live all the way across. Politically, we've done the external balancing. We've seen Quad, you mentioned. There's a whole set of other actions. Thanks to Chinese actions, we have lots of new friends. So we're working with them. But ultimately, the only answer to China is not external, not relying on somebody else. It's relying on ourselves, strengthening ourselves, doing the military reforms, doing the other things. Each of these has begun. I mean, we've started military reforms, fundamental military reforms. But it's too early to say that, oh, we're successful, we're wonderful, we're on the right track. Because frankly, Chinese behavior is changing. What's happening around us is changing so fast that we'll have to be pretty nimble over the next few years.
Now, Andrew, I want to ask you an additional question. Apart from your views on how, someone like you observes the way India's handled China, I would also like you to look at the new developments in Afghanistan, the nexus that China and Pakistan have developed with China, the new big brother there in Afghanistan. What is the kind of danger that poses? So first, let's start with how India's handled its relations with China in the last 2-3 years.
There was a reasonable set of assumptions going into dynamics with China. They'd held for a long time. There were mechanisms that worked. There was some elements of predictability even amid all the competition that took place. China has shifted its approach in ways that have caught almost everyone off guard in different ways. There is a significant process of adjustment now taking place for all states, not just India, to deal with the different phenomenon that we're seeing from China. Some of this, you can reverse engineer it and say this could have been predicted from a long time ago and these sorts of things. But we've had ways of thinking about how we deal with China as a relatively pragmatic, rational actor. There is a framework within which you can still say it's approaching these things rationally, but it's not approaching them with the same level of pragmatism that it was before. It's taking on actors on multiple different fronts right now. So I think going into what India took going into the various blow-ups at the border in the last period of time, I think was a reasonable framework of assumptions. And but the transition to deal with the China that we're now dealing with is not something where one can kind of turn on a sixpence and flip into a new policy. Some of these things require longer-term shifts. Some of them are internal. Some of them are a question of how India now works with, and in some respects takes advantage of precisely the additional impetus, the new friends, the additional focus, including, again, on the economic side, where there are a lot of states that are now looking at the dual circulation strategy, everything that's going on there, and saying, where else can we go right now? And how do we construct an economic structure where China plays less of a part, where some of these forms of dependency don't exist? India is, of course, one of the places that is top of that list, but that will require certain internal dynamics of the sort that Ambassador Menon was talking about. On Afghanistan and China-Pakistan, I mean, China is uncomfortable with where things are right now. It has to be stressed. There's a lot of reason to play up the advantages. China has a long-standing relationship with the Taliban. This was a policy in Afghanistan that Pakistan had pursued. The two are friends, all of these sorts of things. China is having a hard time with CPEC. It's been stalled in certain respects for the last few years. They're frustrated with the pace of it. They've been frustrated with it the entire period of time since Imran Khan took power. The Chinese can deal with the Taliban, but they don't fundamentally like them. They find them to be a hostile ideological force. They find them to be supporting all of the groups they're most concerned about. They're concerned about the implications in Pakistan. They're not sure that Pakistanis entirely have a grip on what the outcome there is likely to be. This is an adverse set of shifts that, as far as China sees, is taking place in its western neighborhood, with very direct practical consequences when you're seeing the sorts of attacks that have taken place, that have escalated on CPEC projects in the last few months, and at precisely a juncture where the US drawdown takes place, where China feels that it's going to be left doing more cleaning up of the mess in a way that it doesn't want to, precisely for the US to pivot its focus to China, the Indo-Pacific, great power competition, and all of these sorts of things. China and Pakistan will have to work more closely together in Afghanistan. This is already happening. China's very dependent on Pakistan for navigating the Taliban, navigating internal Afghan dynamics, but it doesn't mean that they see that as a comfortable picture, or as the outcomes that they're seeing right now in Afghanistan as ones that are necessarily moving in a direction that's entirely consistent with their interests. They want to contain the threats. They want to manage this as best they can. I think they see it as manageable, but it's not a benign outcome from their perspective. They'd have liked the Americans to stick around.
You want 30 seconds on that? I've got.
No, I actually agree with that.
Okay.
And I think the people who should be worrying about what happened in Afghanistan are first the Pakistanis, second the Chinese.
And if you was, each of y'all, one thing that India should be doing to combat China, or contain China, or deal with China. One thing you would say, the big thing, and Andrew, what would you say?
Well, grow at 12%.
Andrew?
I mean, I think India should be one of the central actors in this new coalition building and set the terms of what those coalitions look like. I think there's tremendous scope to shape what these new frameworks amount to, but that will require, I think, being quite proactive about deciding what contours of this new forms of alliance and coalition building best suit Indian interests.
Well, Shivshankar, Menon, Andrew Small, thank you very, very much. Let's give them a warm round of applause. We could have spoken a lot more, but till next time. Thank you.